Good morning, Boker Tov. Today is Thursday, May 16th, and we are gathered here to learn Talmud. So join me in a bracha, a blessing for the study of our sacred tradition. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So having completed a few weeks of study from the Gemara on Pesach, from Tractate Pesachim, we move into the later part of the spring holiday calendar. And I've selected a few texts today that will kind of be a little bit of a potpourri on a couple of different themes, tangentially connected to the festivals, I should say, the observances of this time of year. We are in the 7-week period of counting known as Omer, the Omer period, and the signature mitzvah or ritual for this period is called Sfirata Omer, which means the counting of the Omer. This is a Torahitic biblical commandment. In fact, it just so happens to line up. It's one of the rare times where during the year, what we are reading in the ordinary cycle of weekly parshiot, the weekly Torah readings, line up thematically with where we are seasonally. I often have to clarify and help people through their understandable confusion. Why, for instance, do we read the story of the Exodus from Egypt in midwinter? And the answer is because if you start reading Torah at Simchat Torah, which is generally early fall, then you are obliged to read a section of Torah known as a parasha every single week. It just so happens that by the time you get to the first chapters of the book of Exodus, where the story is told about our deliverance and even the rules for Pesach, that usually just falls in midwinter. It has nothing to do with the fact that Pesach is an observance that is calendrically tracked so that it must always fall in the Hebrew month of Nisan, which is the beginning of spring. As we've talked about this at some length, Pesach has to be a spring festival because so many of our observances are linked to the agriculture and the climate of ancient Israel. You can't have Sukkot in July. It has to be a harvest festival. Therefore, it has to fall in the fall or very late summer. And similarly, Pesach can't happen in January. So the fact that we read about Pesach in the cycle of Torah readings really has nothing to do with the fact that Pesach is a spring festival. However, this week, the portion we're reading just happens to be the parasha called Emor, from around the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th chapters of the book of Leviticus. And Emor is the Torah portion that just happens to include the calendar of biblical festivals and denotes how they are to be observed. And it just so happens that among those observances, the counting of the Omer is stipulated in this week's Torah portion. Again, this is really just a coincidence that I happen to be talking to you during the period of the Omer. Oh, I don't know what just happened there. I didn't even mean to hit something. What the heck? Okay. Hi. What's going on? It gave me a whiteboard. Stop.
Yeah, I'm having this problems. I can't see my own name up.
Yeah, so weird. I see your name. I just don't see your face. You may want to stop and restart your camera.
I
No,
did.
this is the problem. They've artificially intelligenced Zoom so much that I feel like I'm losing control over the basic functions of how we learn online. Nevertheless, I do like learning online. It allows people to come from far and near. It allows you to show up in your jammies. It allows us to have a single text on a screen instead of making, handouts for 30 people. So by and large, I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but here we are in weird Zoom land. Anyway, so the counting of the Omer is a prescribed ritual. It is a mitzvah. Therefore, it is appropriate to say a birkat mitzvah, blessing for a mitzvah, whenever you recite the week and day of the Omer, which is a nightly ritual that begins on the first day after the first Seder. So like second night of Pesach is when the Omer counting starts. And that gets you exactly 49 days of counting. And then the day after that will be Shavuot, the spring festival, which is linked to Pesach by 7 weeks. And in fact, the express purpose of counting the Omer is to draw a kind of link, spiritual, historical, cognitive, between the festival of freedom, the liberation from bondage of Pesach, and the completion of our deliverance at Sinai, which Shavuot commemorates. Also, there is an agricultural link between the two festivals. Pesach is the very beginning of the spring, and so it marks the kind of like, the first signs of green, of new life, hence eating of karpas, which is linked to springtime. And Shavuot marks the completion of the ripening of the early grain of the harvest season. The first grain to be cultivated seasonally is barley. And so an Omer literally means a sheaf specifically of barley. So I went into the Gemara to explore over the last week where we can find texts about the counting of the Omer, and they're all from Tractate Menachot, which has to do with meal offerings. And that kind of makes sense if you consider that Shavuot is a grain festival, and the period of the Omer is a period where we observe the ripening of the first fruits, specifically fruit, meaning grain in this case, barley harvest, and that the custom in biblical times evidently was to bring an Omer, a sheaf of barley, up to the temple to be presented to the priest for certain sacrificial offerings, and even just to wave it in the air as if to say, thank you, God, for ripening the grain, and to propitiate God, God, please keep it up. We need this to live. And so Tractate Menachot gets into the counting of the Omer. It talks in what I would consider to be somewhat excruciating detail. How do we know which is the first day of the Omer for counting, since the Torah says you should count off 50 days or 7 weeks of days, presumably from Pesach, but it doesn't exactly say what day after Pesach. And so the Gemara goes to, kind of deep into the weeds of figuring out exactly which day is meant for the start of the counting so that you land on Shavuot in time without a deficit of days or a surplus of days in your counting. You can't have a counting that lasts 53 days. It has to be exactly 49 days plus Shavuot on the 50th. And then it goes into all sorts of rules and regulations for the grinding of barley into flour, and whether or not such flour is eligible for the mitzvah of taking challah, the dough offering. And honestly, it's pretty boring stuff. That's my subjective analysis. So I want to spare you a lot of that. Feel free to read Tractate Menachot if you dare, starting on page 65 and following. And you'll get all of the jots and tittles about counting the Omer and taking your barley grain offering and grinding it into flour and extracting the challah offering from the grain. If that's your jam, by all means, enjoy. But I did find one passage that I think has a little bit more to offer, not just to nourish, if we're talking about grain here, not just to nourish the mind, but also maybe to nourish the soul. Because Jewish tradition would come to associate this period of Omer with sadness. Usually when I describe the Omer, I have to use something like the made-up term of semi-mourning. It's a period of semi-mourning. It's not like a Tisha B'Av. We are not required to fast, which is a mourning custom, mourning, in Judaism. On the other hand, it's not exactly a festive time like the festivals that bookend it, right? Pesach and Shavuot are chagim. You have to rejoice. Whereas the Omer, somewhat the opposite. You are restrained from rejoicing. So even if it's not a period of full sackcloth and ashes, it is also a time where most of us have probably heard along the way that traditionally weddings are not conducted during the Omer. This is a very customary rabbinic regulation. By the way, all of my Orthodox rabbi friends will not conduct weddings during the Omer. That is considered the level of halacha. You must not conduct weddings during the Omer. Most conservative rabbis as well. Maybe some of you who asked a conservative rabbi or an Orthodox rabbi to do your wedding were disappointed or surprised to learn that there are 7 full weeks when the weather is perfect, where your rabbi might have said, no, sorry, can't do it. And you had to say, but why, rabbi? And the rabbi would have to explain, well, it's the Omer, and it's a 7-week period where weddings are restricted. There is one day, which is an exception to that rule, which is the 33rd day of the Omer, which is known as Lag BaOmer, Lag being the Hebrew word spelled Lamed Gimel. Lamed is denotes the number 30. As you probably are aware, all Hebrew letters have a numerical value. Aleph through Tet, the first 10 letters of the alphabet are 1 through 10. And then after Tet, we count by tens. So Tet is 10. Tet is 9, rather. Yud is 10. And then Kaf is 20. Lamed is 30. Mem is 40. Nun is 50, and so on and so forth. And then once you get to Kuf, which is 100, you count by hundreds. So Kuf is 100. Resh is 200, Shin is 300, and Tav, the last letter of the alphabet, is 400. And using all 22 letters of the alphabet, you can therefore make any number. So it's a kind of interesting enumeration system using the letters of the alphabet. Lag is Lamed, which equals 30, plus Gimel, which is 3, 33. So Lag just means the 33rd day of the Omer. The question is reasonably asked, why? Why do we have this? Why do we associate the 7 weeks of the Omer with semi-mourning, or at least why are we restrained from the fullness of joy? And why do we get a one-day reprieve? And so that actually invites us to take a look at some text, which there is a text on this. So what I'd like to do is take a look at a section of Tractate Menachot, not Menachot, Tractate Yevamot, which is interestingly the tractate that putatively is about levirate marriage. I'm not going to explain any of that right now because it really is another rabbit hole. So I'm going to start with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, just to set us up here. I'm going to start just in the English, and then we'll do a little bit of the original text, Hebrew Aramaic. It is taught in a Baraita, so I'm starting right here, that Rabbi Yehoshua says, if a man married his woman in his youth, by the way, the subject of levirate marriage kind of leads us on a winding path to this comment, which is all about what do you do when a spouse dies? What does a woman do if she is widowed? What are the obligations of the woman? But even more importantly, what are the obligations of the now dead husband's family? The traditional obligation is for the brother of the deceased husband to be the levir, which is the levirate groom. He has to step in and basically take his wife in the name of his deceased brother. That's levirate marriage. Okay, there, I did explain it. That is taught in the Baraita that Rabbi Yehoshua says, if a man married a woman in his youth and she passed away, she died, he should marry another woman in his old age. If he had children in his youth, he should have more children in his old age. As it is stated, and there's a biblical verse to support this claim, in the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. So keep spreading your seed, right? For you do not know which shall prosper, whether this or that, or whether they both alike shall be good. In other words, even if you have kids from your first marriage, you should have more kids. How many of you are familiar with the Israeli television program Shtisel? If you watch Shtisel, this actually comes up. It's a plot point in Shtisel, and it suggests that this is still a norm in Haredi society. that if a woman dies young, or in the case of widowhood, even having had children in your youth does not release you from the mitzvah of continuing to be fruitful and multiply with another spouse in your older age. So willfully disproving F. Scott Fitzgerald, who once said that there are no second acts in, well, he would have said American life, but in Jewish life either. We disprove that by suggesting, no, you should have second and third and fourth acts if, God forbid, your spouse dies. You should, it is like, you must take another spouse. So continuing just with the text here, this verse indicates, as Steinsaltz teaches, that a man should continue having children even after fulfilling the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. You're probably wondering, wait a minute, Blake, what does this have to do with the Omer? We're getting there. All right. Rabbi Akiva adds a very important gloss. And this is where we're going to go to the Hebrew here. Lamad. So this teaches, lamad, from like Talmud, lomed, Torah biyalduto, that one who had Torah, one who studied Torah in his youth, yalduto, the word for a child is yeled, right? Shalom yeladim, hello children. Yilmod Torah beziknuto. So this teaches that if one taught Torah in his youth, one must teach Torah in his old age. Hayulo talmidim biyalduto, if he had students of Torah, talmidim, from the same root, lamad, right? If he had students of Torah in his youth, yulo talmidim biziknuto, he should also take students in his old age. Shene'emar, baboker zara et zarecha bagomer, the same verse from Ecclesiastes. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. So having children and teaching Torah are both considered to fulfill the same mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply in the Jewish tradition. And by the way, this is true. The rabbis teach this in response, for instance, to couples who remain barren, who cannot have children. Of course, coming from an ancient time and milieu in which the fertility options and surrogacy options that are open to infertile couples today were not available at the time, of course. Nevertheless, Jewish tradition has always affirmed, or at least since the time of Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages of the Mishnaic community, that to teach a child Torah is as if one has fulfilled the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply, of having children oneself and to raising children. Baboker zara. Okay, so sow your seed, in the evening do not withhold your hand. Amru, they said, Shnemasar Aleph Zugim Talmidim Hayu Lo l'Rabbi Akiva. So it was said that Shnemasar, that's a 12 Aleph, 12,000 Zugim are pairs of students did Rabbi Akiva have. Sorry for the Yoda-like syntax here. So Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students. Why pairs of students, by the way? Why are we talking about students in pairs? Why don't they just say Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students? Mom and Dad.
Because you're supposed to study in pairs.
Supposed to study in chavruta. Zugim in this case, but chavruta. This is the Jewish norm of study is you shouldn't do it alone. Okay, very good. So Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students. Migvat ad Antipras. So from these two places, from Givata Antipatris, they say is the city in ancient Judea. V'chulan metu beperek echad, and they just happened to all die at the same time, or over one period of time. Mipnei shelo na'agvu kavod ze lazeh. Why? Because they did not show respect to one another. They did not treat each other with respect. So this is the legend that the Gemara relates, and then the coda to this little story. V'aya la'olam shamem, and the world would lay desolate. The world lay desolate Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva, until Rabbi Akiva came along, etzel rabotenu shebadarom, unto his community of rabbis in the south. The darom is the south. Ushna'a lahem, and this is the word shna'a, another word for to teach, from Mishnah, and he mishna'd them, he taught them. Rabbi Meir, the Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Yosei, the Rabbi Shimon, the Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, all of those guys, vehem hem he'emidu Torah tasha'a, and it was they who upheld the study of Torah at that time. In other words, Rabbi Akiva did not throw in the towel after this calamity, this awful catastrophe of 24,000 or 12,000 pairs of his students all perishing at the same time, presumably from some epidemic or plague. But the real reason, the rabbis tell us, is because they wouldn't treat each other with respect. They all died. But then what did Rabbi Akiva do? He, gathered up. He went down to the south. He found another community of leading rabbis, and he raised them up to Torah as well. So fulfilling the principle that if a person experiences a death, that does not obviate one's obligation to keep either having children or to raise up disciples of Torah. So quite a lovely passage, except for the painful part right there in the middle. Now, again, where do we learn, though, that this has anything to do with the period of the counting of the Omer, which, as I have said, is a period of semi-mourning in the Jewish tradition? Well, the answer is, let me see if I can find it. I had it up, and then I had it up and I screwed it up. Commentary. Hang on for a second. I think that I had a tab open that I accidentally closed. Here we go. Yeah, here we go. So we're going to look at the commentary of the Meiri. The Meiri, a very prominent rabbi and Talmud commentator from Provence, so from southern France, latter half of the 13th century. So the late 1200s, born in 1249, died in 1315. So here's the Meiri on Yevamot, on the passage we're looking at. So the Meiri says, even if one married a woman in his youth, he should marry again in his old age. If he had children in his youth, he should have children again, meaning to say, even if he already fulfilled the commandment of fruitfulness and multiplication. And this is a rabbinic edict as opposed to a Torah edict, as explained earlier on Yevamot 61b. If one studied Torah in his youth and so forth, if he had students in his youth, he should have them again in his old age. As sometimes those from his youth die, and the ones from his old age come and complete the educational work needed. So the work goes on. One is not released of the obligation to raise up students of Torah, even when one is old. They said about Rabbi Akiva that he had 12,000 pairs of students, and they all died in one period of time because they did not treat each other with respect, and the world was desolate of Torah until Rabbi Akiva came to our rabbis in the south and taught them. They are Rabbi Meir, Yehuda, Yossi, Shimon, and Elazar ben Shamua. They're just what we read. And these are the very ones who upheld the time, or there's missing a word here, upheld Torah at that time. Okay, here's Meiri's important comment. And it is mentioned here that these earlier students all died from Pesach until Shavuot, but it is a tradition in the hands of the Geonim, the great geniuses of the Talmud. So, and he's just citing kind of like everyone knows, or this is a tradition that has been passed down to us, that the dying stopped. So they all died from Pesach to Shavuot. Of course, that is the Omer, but the dying stopped on the day of Lag BaOmer. So there was a temporary reprieve on the 33rd day of the Omer. So as a result of that, we are accustomed not to fast on it, which is interesting that he uses the word fast, because fasting is not at this point, and I don't know if it ever was, an actual tradition associated with the Omer. As I've said, it's not Tisha B'Av. It's not at that level of sobriety and sadness. but it is also not a time of full rejoicing. So rather than saying you have to participate in mourning rituals, we say you should refrain from joy. The other thing that is customarily not done during the Omer is trimming one's hair or beard, except for Lag BaOmer, which is like official Jewish haircut day. A very interesting custom. Why? Because the growing of the beard is a custom associated with mourning during Shiva. Some say during Shloshim, and some say even during the first whole year of mourning for an immediate family member. Men traditionally do not shave. So sometimes if you do see a person who has grown a beard since you last saw him, you may inquire, is everything okay? Are you in mourning? That is a custom in Jewish life. Again, the idea being that when you're a mourner, you're not supposed to be paying attention to the vanity of everyday life, but rather you're supposed to kind of be focused on being a mourner. And so let it all hang out, let it grow. As a result of that, we are accustomed not to fast on it, and we are also accustomed, as a result of that, not to marry a woman, not to have a wedding from Pesach until that time, meaning until Shavuot, with the exception of Lag BaOmer. So there it is. There's probably the most famous Jewish custom about Omer, but it is related to us in this sidebar to the Gemara itself, courtesy of the Meiri. How long this custom has been going on, we don't know. These midrashic traditions, the Agadah, the folklore around the students of Akiva, and the fact that the plague took them, and the fact that the plague happened during the 7 weeks of the Omer, and the fact that there was a one-day reprieve from the plague. How old are these traditions? Where exactly did they come from? I do not know. But I thought I would share them with you before making another detour. Michelle, and then Mom and Dad, please.
I recall a Lag BaOmer tradition story associated with going out from Roman-occupied Jerusalem to hiding it under a hunting expedition, and then when they got out there, they went and studied.
Oh, find that for me, because I'm not
That
familiar.
doesn't ring a bell. All right, I will find a source for that, but that's
Yeah,
not...
often when people share things like that, a loud bell will ring. This one, not even a distant bell rings. So, I mean, look,
I will research.
there are lots of stories that are told about the privations and the kind of canceling of public Jewish life during Roman occupation, and the peril that certain heroes of the rabbinic community put themselves in order to preserve Torah. The most famous, of course, being Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the eyewitnesses to the siege of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans in the year 70, and who smuggled himself out in a casket, not so much actually to escape the Romans, but to escape the zealot Jews who believed that if you were not taking up arms against the Romans, that you were a traitor to the cause. So his own fellow, Meshuggah Jews, the extremists, we've always had violent extremists, alas. And if you read the disturbing, but I think necessary, important coverage of the kind of unfettered Jewish violent extremism that has been unchecked in the West Bank for quite some time, and that is being allowed to persist, which only inflames the tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Israel and the world community, and it makes it easier for Israel to be defamed for the sins of its occupation and all sorts of other difficulties that we are encountering today. There have always been violent extremists within the Jewish tradition, and we have them even in this ancient folklore. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai smuggled himself out in a coffin and was managed to get all the way to present himself to the Emperor of Rome to plead not so much for mercy for the Jewish people, but to preserve a community in Yavne where he could raise up disciples and the tradition of Torah would live on. And of course, that would become the first community of the rabbis who would eventually write the Mishnah and the Talmud. That's the famous story. But something about under the guise of a hunting expedition, sneaking out under Roman occupation, that one's new to me. So you've got some fun homework to do. Mom and dad.
This whole thing strikes me as really weird. I mean, in term for a variety of reasons, this is the first time I've heard of 24,000 teenagers dying in a single period of time. It seems kind of harsh. If this was a natural phenomenon, to say this was because they didn't treat each other with respect, I mean, that in a sense sounds very, the kind of thing that somebody might have said to Job. But I'm just having a hard time getting my head around. Did this thing act, was this an event that we have any historical record of?
We
Or
don't, and that's part of the
where did
problem.
this
So
crazy
I
thing
share
come
your
from?
I share your discomfort. Whenever you're studying these texts, my approach tends to favor the historical critical approach to these texts and to look at the historical circumstances that may or may not have surrounded the composition of these texts. That also gets into questions of authorship and readership, or I should say, since not everybody who encountered these texts was likely to be reading them, given the high rate of illiteracy in antiquity. One could simply ask, who's the author, or who are the authors, and who's the intended audience? And the problem, as it is with all literature, about which the origins are not known or well known, is that I usually visualize a kind of matrix where one axis is called existential reality, right? To what degree does the thing that we're reading about reflect an actual condition or something that the writers actually encountered? And then the horizontal axis, you can just say imagination, literary imagination. How much of this is simply the authors telling a story? And I usually believe that most literature is actually a cross product, right? There's not really any such thing as pure nonfiction and pure fiction. I don't like the binary categories of fiction and nonfiction, even in bookstores. Like, I get it. You want to read, some people say, I like nonfiction, I like reading biographies and histories. And other people are like, no, I like reading novels, I like fantasy, I like sci-fi. But the fact of the matter is, the best novels, the best fantasy, often are commenting on real conditions, like real life, right? So read 1984, classic example. Is 1984 about a dystopian future? It was written in 1948, by the way, so Orwell was inverting the numbers of the years, right? Or was it a commentary on fascism from the perspective of 1948? The answer is, well, it's both. It's a cross product between the existential reality of the authors in the case of most ancient literature that we encounter, probably composite works. That's another complicating factor. So the problem is we don't have any like extra textual, meaning other books or archaeological evidence to back up the claim that there was a plague that killed 24,000 pupils. Probably, as you're right, teenage boys, probably adolescents. So how much of that is existential reality? Obviously, once you get to the end of the text, that the reason for their death is not, it's not natural, it's not an epidemic, it's not an earthquake or plague, it's actually, in a sense, it's a psychological comment about what Judaism values. The text is used as an object lesson of kind of like, look out, young men, like, it's not just, the goal here is not just to create a class of brilliant Talmud scholars. If you can't treat each other with respect, then you've missed the whole point. So how much of this, clearly the usage of this passage is intended to be allegorical and not just fact or history reporting. So the only thing I can say is, yeah, I embrace the weirdness. And I believe that the weirdness of this text is a question of degree in the literature, perhaps, which is why it strikes us with such kind of strange force, as opposed to there's something sui generis, something unique about this kind of literature. All literature is a cross product of the imagination or the storytelling capacity of the author and the existential reality. And good history writing, by the way, in the converse here. So, like, I used 1984, which obviously you're going to find that in fiction when you go to your bookstore. But even a good history, like read a history of World War II, of course, it's intended to be a reporting of the facts, but it draws on all of the conventions of good storytelling. Like you have to have a story you want to tell. And that's why there will never be an end to the books, to the history books about World War II, because you can't just assemble all the facts. You have to narrate a story here. And you will draw on the conventions of fiction. You will develop characters, and you will have your characters undergo plot and character transformation, and there will be a climax, and there will be a denouement. Like all story, good writing is good writing, and good storytelling is good storytelling. Anne, you have to unmute, my friend. Oops, I do it one more time. That was my bad. Try it one more time. There you go.
There's something called creative nonfiction, which I took when I went for my master's degree at age 80. But it's called creative nonfiction,
I
and
love
it's
that. Perfect.
it's a lot of fun to write also.
Great. Yeah, in my view, kind of like all literature is a blend of fiction and nonfiction. But again, I don't like the binary categories. And I especially don't like demeaning fiction as somehow less valuable than nonfiction. Like, I've learned more about the human condition from Shakespeare and Chaucer than I have from a whole lot of history books. Okay, reading on. So what I wanted to do here was actually kind of extrapolate from the custom associated with the Omer, that this is a period for public mourning, and that in a very public way, an overt way, Jewish people actually take on the appearance of mourners for 7 weeks, traditionally during the Omer. And some of this, by the way, I surmise, or here I'm making a conjecture, is one of many ways in which the Jewish community, as it became urbanized, as it moved farther away, both geographically, but especially chronologically, farther away in time from its agricultural origins, its biblical agricultural origins, Judaism it evolves into a diasporic, meaning dispersed, urbanized civilization, and less a biblical farming and shepherding collective. So our civilization evolves as our demography and geography evolves, and our civilization evolves. That makes sense, and that is reflected in Jewish religious practice, in that we need new meanings to associate with biblical observances, or they will lose their meaning. So for those of us living outside of, the communities of planting and harvesting barley, the Omer could easily have lost its meaning. Shavuot, originally a barley harvest festival, really is irrelevant to the experience of Jews living in Baghdad in the Middle Ages, right? So for them, the necessity of Shavuot being transformed from a harvest festival into a festival of receiving Torah at Sinai, which is the story that's superimposed on the agricultural cycle, on the seasonal observance, actually comes to dominate the meaning of the season. Right? Most people associate Pesach with liberation and the story of freedom from bondage, which is, I would say, much more universally applicable and not contingent on living in an agricultural society. Whereas the original meaning of Pesach was, for shepherds, it was the feast of the spring lamb. For farmers, it was the feast of unleavened bread. So whether you're a shepherd or a farmer, the two kind of mainstays of the biblical Israelite economy, shepherding, herding as well, cattle herding, but shepherding and farming, dealing with livestock and dealing with plants. Cain and Abel, by the way. Cain was the farmer and Abel was the shepherd, and the two of them clearly are kind of mortal enemies. I'm not suggesting that these two communities were always united. All I'm suggesting is that for our agricultural biblical community, the meanings associated with ancient Pesach are much less relevant when you're living in Baghdad in 1400. Okay, you follow what I'm saying here. So the idea that the Omer transcends its agricultural significance and becomes a way of connecting the Pesach experience to the Shavuot experience and gives us a way to observe a 50-day period. Like, you can't have a holiday that lasts 50 days, but there are certain things you can do to mark time. So the rituals associated with Omer are the counting itself, which is biblical. We're not going up to the temple waving grains of sheaves of barley grain, but we are counting the days, growing our beards, refraining from public celebration, and entering this period of semi-mourning. And again, we need a story to go with that. That's the story of Akiva and his disciples. This is not the only public mourning ritual in the Jewish tradition. And I want to highlight that just this past week, probably the most painful Yom Ha-Zikaron in recent memory, maybe in the 76 years of Israel's history, coming as it does right on the cusp of the very next day, when Yom Ha'Atzmaut, or Israel's Independence Day, is observed. The two are paired. I love that they do that. It would be as if Memorial Day on the American calendar were to be observed on July 3rd, which I think would be much more meaningful. But we need two holidays for barbecues and car sales. So, and mattress sales, apparently. Those are the things you do on Memorial Day. You buy mattresses and cars, and you cook hot dogs on a grill. Whereas in Israel, all of Memorial Day, from sundown to sundown, is intense public mourning. And I have a couple of Israeli friends, and I checked in on them on Yom Ha-Zikaron, which was observed on Monday night into
Sunday night.
Sunday night into Monday, thank you. And then Yom Ha'atzmaut was Monday night into Tuesday. And it was a muted celebration this year. It's very hard to have a rah-rah, everybody out in the streets shooting silly string and firecrackers and making merry, which is part of the very public joy in Israel. I like Israelis in that they're a little bit more unhinged about joy and sorrow. They're much more public about joy and sorrow than I think Americans are. We're a little bit more Protestant, for lack of a better word. We're a little bit more stoic in public mourning. Not all Americans. I think most Black American culture is very demonstrative emotionally, like public observances, whether it's a funeral. Hey, you ever been to a Black funeral? Like, you are expected to cry and geschrei. Whereas a Reformed Jewish funeral, at least a Reformed Jewish funeral, people will look at you funny if you're too emotional. God forbid you should be weeping that somebody you love just died. I'm not saying this is not a blanket statement. It's an overall, yes, I'm trafficking in stereotypes, but most stereotypes have some kernel of truth to them. So I do want to talk a little bit more about public mourning, because this past week we really were witness to an intensely painful public mourning in Israel and among all people who are very much in touch with the pain of October 7th and the pain since October 7th. So we're going to do that through another Gemara text from a totally different tractate. Judy Gross.
I just want to express something that I experienced. Yom Ha-Zikaron, a commemoration that was put on by a group of Rishonim, young people who are doing their gap year between high school and army in the States. One of the young women is living with my daughter's family. She's an amazing person. And I went to
in New Jersey?
She's in New Jersey, and it's a New Jersey cohort of Rishonim who are together, young people. And they were responsible for putting on a Yom Ha-Zikaron commemoration. It was extremely, you can imagine, extremely difficult and mournful, and made an amazing impression on me. First of all, the ceremony started with a siren.
Yeah,
so
which is how Yom Ha-Zikaron and Yom HaShoah are announced in Israel, with air raid sirens going off across the whole country, and literally traffic will come to an absolute standstill. Like, it is holy time. If that siren's going off, you stop what you're doing, even if it's driving 60 miles an hour on a highway. You stop, you get out of your car, and you stand solemnly and silently for the full 2 minutes of the siren. Go on, Judy.
And anyway, starting with that just makes an impression. We were stuck, and it started with being stuck and in time in a way, and being in an Israeli time. Anyway, it was an amazing program. People read our sweet Rishon asked my 17-year-old granddaughter to read a passage about a young woman who had died, and Maya was the mother, and she said, "I love you, honey, be well." And she was going off to anyway, just the total expression of mourning made me realize how this is an Israeli commemoration. We can't even understand what it means being here in the United States.
Very different. Like there is no regular television programming or radio programming in Israel. The whole day is devoted to recitation of names of the fallen, particularly since October 7th this year, but in any other year, it would be recitation of the names of thousands and thousands of Israelis whose lives have been given in sacrifice to the freedom of the country. In Israel's many wars, tens of thousands of Israelis since the founding of the state have died in war. It is commemorated with traditional songs. There have been many songs of open mourning written since October 7th. Even the one of the finalists, it did place as a finalist song, though did not win top prize at Eurovision last week. Israel was not canceled from Eurovision, and the song "Hurricane" by Eyal Golan is a beautiful song. It's called Hurricane, and it's basically how do I withstand this hurricane? And although Eurovision censored out any explicit references to October 7th, everyone knows that that's what it's about. So it's a very intense time.
That song was sung by young women. There was a dance.
That's become like the anthem of October 7th.
There was a dance of three women who one of them choreographed it. It was torturous and beautiful.
Yeah.
And actually our young woman was in the dancing. Just what I want to say is, and this might be naive, maybe everybody knows this, but every citizen of Israel is a soldier.
Right. Yeah,
And
which is a double-edged sword, pun intended, because the extremists among Hamas, of course, Hamas is all extremist, and extremists who sympathize with Hamas have used the, I think, morally horrific, morally shoddy argument that, well, because every Israeli is conscripted into the IDF, every with an asterisk, 1 out of every 5 Israelis who is not Jewish is not conscripted. So Muslims, Arabs are not conscripted, even if they are citizens. And the Haredi have this corrupt exemption from military service, which is a thorn in the side of most Israelis, by the way, except the power brokers in Netanyahu's extremist coalition. But yes, the idea that Israel has a conscripted civilian army has been used by Israel's enemies to justify terror attacks against civilians. So we have to be very careful how much we.
Yeah, that's right. I say that as a Jew who loves Israel. And the fact is, every Israeli has to defend their country. That's right. in that meaning.
And every Israeli has multiple personal close connections with people who have been killed in war or terror. Every Israeli.
That's the point.
Your best friend, your cousin, somebody you grew up with, your teacher, your husband, your wife, God forbid, but your child, your grandchild. That is what it is to be an Israeli. And you have to understand the collective psyche makes Israelis very different from Americans. We're all, it's the Jewish state. We're Jews too. They are family. But the psychic template of an Israeli is very different from the psychic template of an American Jew.
That's what I felt.
And I feel that, I hope that public observances like Yom Ha-Zikaron, Yom Ha-Shoah helps increase empathy. I'm not saying outside the Jewish community. Like you, I'm vexed and disappointed at, the abandonment of the Jewish people by people we perceive to be allies, but welcome to being Jewish. Sometimes it's lonely to be a Jew. Okay, Barbara, and then we'll do some text.
No, I just want to mention in in terms of remembrance, my sister-in-law died in a terrorist bombing in Afula, and this was her 30th year.
Oh, may her memory be a blessing.
Yeah, 30 years ago. And the whole family, extended, close, everyone has been affected.
Of course.
In Israel, here, everyone.
Thank you for sharing.
Mhm.
So I'm very grateful to teach the following passage of Gemara in the name of the one who taught it to me on Yom Ha-Zikaron. I had the lovely privilege of spending about 2.5 or 3 days off site. So my normal day off is a Monday. So Monday, all day Tuesday, and then yesterday morning, I was about 20 miles north of here in Briarcliff Manor at a retreat center. It's the Edith Macy Center, which is actually the official retreat site of the Girl Scouts of America. So it's owned by the Girl Scouts. No cookies. Really disappointed. The food is quite good for like an institutional retreat center. It's not like luxury. It's fairly Spartan accommodations, but the food's good, but no cookies. Anyway, went there with the board of the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, despite the fancy and unwieldy title, just means the Reform Rabbinate. So there are like 2,200 Reform rabbis spread out over mostly the US and North America, but all over the world, including a number in Israel who have their own organization. And the CCAR since the 1880s has been the organization that brings together all Reform rabbis. It was the part of the great vision and output of the great Isaac Mayer Wise, the father of American Reform Judaism, and so much more. So I'm on the board of the CCAR. I've been serving in that capacity for about 1.5 years now. And we do this offsite once in May, once in December. And my friend and colleague, Rabbi Rick Kellner, who is a rabbi serving a Reform congregation in Columbus, Ohio, shared the following text with our group by way of providing us with some material for contemplation and study on Yom Ha-Zikaron. Because when you put a group of Reform rabbis together, we do like to study a little bit together, though much of what we are doing is much more business stuff. Okay. So this is from Tractate Chagigah, page 5b. And Chagigah is a section of Talmud that, again, nominally is about festival offerings, but you're going to see we're kind of way off on a detour here. And I'm actually going to start with the sidebar. So I'd like you to turn your attention to the right-hand side of the screen, where I've called up verse 16 from, as you can see up here, Jeremiah chapter 13. So, Tenu ladonai Elohechem, I'm reading biblical text now. Tenu ladonai Elohechem kavod. So give kavod, or honor, to Adonai your God. B'terem yachshich, which means before the darkness comes. Uveterem yitnagafu raglechem, and before your feet give way, your feet stumble. Al harei nashef, upon the mountains in shadow. V'kivitem leor v'sama litzalmavet. This is a very difficult prophetic poetic Hebrew. It says v'kivitem. This is actually from the same root as hatikva, a word that you of course know, meaning the hope. So v'kivitem, and you hope. And you hope leor, for light, v'sama litzalmava, that it might come into the shadow of death. Litzalmavet is actually a familiar word from Psalm 23, which talks about Gam ki elech begeit salmavet, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Salmavet literally means the shadow of death, though it probably is just an idiomatic poetic word that means deep gloom. So you pray for light to come into the shadow of death. And it says, Vishit, and may it, so that it might turn la'arafel. It will turn into deep gloom. Oh, this very dark and mysterious prophecy. Give honor to God, Better do it now before the darkness descends, before your feet stumble on the mountains in shadow, when you hope for light and it is turned to darkness and becomes deep gloom. The next verse. V'im lo tishma'uha, for if you do not give heed, it says here, and again, there's the word shema. So if you don't listen, if you do not give heed, b'mistarim tivke nafshi mipnei geva. Then my inmost self must weep because of your arrogance. Who's the my here? Presumably, it is the first person narrative voice of the prophet speaking for God. Remember, when the prophet speaks in the first person, the prophet is almost always acting as God's mouthpiece. So the prophet is just the human conduit for the message from the divine. So if you do not give heed, then I will weep. My soul will weep. My inmost self, nefesh, nafshi, this word here. Mipnei geva, because of your pride, because of your arrogance. Vidamoa tidma, and it will weep out copious tears. It will really like just break forth in overt weeping. Viterade nidim and again, tears will fall from my eyes. Ki nishba eder Adonai, for God's flock has been taken captive. All right, so that's the biblical text that I want us to just kind of sit with. It's a poetic text, so rather than kind of like analyzing it critically, just kind of let it wash over you. Again, the text says, take heed and acknowledge God before it's too late, before this great catastrophe, for even God is weeping in the innermost place of the heart for the Jewish people who have been taken captive. Recall, by the way, that the prophet Jeremiah, the history surrounding the figure, of course, is shrouded in mythology and lack of extra-textual or archaeological evidence, but Jeremiah, according to his own testimony, was an eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Judea to the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and the exile of the Jewish aristocracy, and actually ends up going with the exilic community back to Egypt. That's where Jeremiah lives out the end of his days. So Jeremiah is a prophet of doom in the literal sense of that phrase. He's literally a prophet who doesn't just forecast, he doesn't prognosticate as much as he reports. Now, he also theologizes and moralizes around the calamity. He doesn't just say, here's what I saw with my own eyes. He said, because the Jewish people were reckless and heedless, and especially because they broke faith with God and they practiced idolatry and they did all these terrible things, they got what they had coming to them, namely ruin and exile. But there's this empathic portrayal of a God who weeps. And that text is, you need the biblical text to understand how it will be used in the Gemara. So the God who weeps is where I want to apply our focus. And now closing the sidebar, which was the biblical verse, we're going to look at a passage from the Gemara. Okay, so we're looking at Tractate Chagigah 5b, starting at paragraph 10, as you can see on the screen here. I hope everyone can see what I have up in front of me. V'im tishma'ucha b'mistarim tivke nafshi mipnei geva. That's the line from the passage in Jeremiah that we just examined, 13:17. The verse states, but if you will not hear it, if you will not heed God's message, then my soul will weep for your pride. How do the rabbis understand this? Rav Shmuel bar Inya said in the name of Rav, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the KBH, the Holy One, blessed be God, has a place and its name is Mistarim. Steinsaltz, I think, is holding our hands through this. I wish he hadn't. I wish he had let us as the reader figure this out. So God has a secret place. How do we know it's a secret place? Because the word Mistarim means hidden or secret. So a secret in Hebrew is called a seter. So mistarim, literally the place of secrets. And what does God need this place for? That's where God goes to cry. And what is the meaning of the second part of the verse? For your pride. Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, a different Shmuel, said God cries due to the pride of the Jewish people, the arrogance of the Jewish people, but also the honor of the Jewish people, he interprets here, which was taken from them and given to the Gentile nations. So he's not just moralizing here, he's also just weeping over what it means to be a Jew in history, which is that to be a Jew is to endure conquest and exile and murder and destruction and bloodshed and humiliation, while the Gentile nations reap in power and acclaim, right? While the poor Jewish nation is oppressed and downtrodden. And again, Jeremiah is, of course, an eyewitness to this and therefore a firsthand authority, but so are the rabbis. The entire, and I say this very often, if you want to understand, like, again, getting back to that matrix of existential reality versus imagination, the idea that God has a crying room is, of course, an imaginative conceit. It's a literary conceit, and it's all prophecy. Most prophecy is also poetry. So read it like you read poetry. But on the other hand, there is an existential reality for these rabbis, which is that they're living in exile. And all of the things that their Bible talks about in terms of sovereignty and power and glory and protection from the divine and, God will vanquish our enemies. None of that is the existential condition of the rabbinic community. They're all living and writing in exile. After all, we're studying the Babylonian Talmud. Was not written in Eretz Yisrael, which was the whole force of the covenantal promise, right? Everything in the Torah, at least in the books of Genesis and Exodus, also Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, has a direction. We're leading to the promised land. We're leading to redemption. But the real lived condition of the Jewish people is in exile. And so that tension informs the way the rabbis write, even when they're drawing on these folkloric conventions, which are poetic or even drawn from what, again, I don't like this term, but what would we consider fiction? Reading on. The Gemara says, Umi ika b'chia kame hakadosh baruch hu? But wait a minute. How can there be crying? And when it says before the Holy One, blessed be He, this is interesting. Does this mean you can't cry in God's presence, or are what we really saying, which is I think the case, how can we talk about a God who's crying? This doesn't make sense with what we know. And of course, we're going to quote a verse here. Didn't Rav Papa say, there's no, what is the Tom Hanks line from A League of Their Own? There's no crying in baseball. All right. So in Judaism, there's no crying in God's presence, because in the presence of God, honor and majesty are before him. Strength and gladness are in his place, from First Chronicles. So we have the biblical verse. And of course, Rav Papa is doing a very rabbinic thing. He's saying, wait a minute, I have a biblical proof text that says, when you're with God, it's all happy land, right? It's not candy land, but it's glory. And the Gemara says, again, so the biblical verse here is, Hod v'hadar lefanav, honor and glory are in God's presence. Uz, which is strength, v'chedva bimkomo, and gladness. Chedva is a word, it's in the Sheva Brachot, the wedding benedictions. It means like just pure joy in God's place, bimkomo. And then the Gemara chimes in, la kashya. Really important Talmudic phrase, it comes up a lot. La kashya. This is not difficult. In other words, there's no contradiction here. We've got an apparent contradiction, right? There's a passage that talks about weeping in the mistarim, in this chamber, because God is sad for the Jewish people and their real condition. And yet we have this other text that says, no, when you're with God, it's all happy. Okay. Ha bevate gavae, ha bevate varae. So how do they translate that? One refers to the innermost chambers, where God can cry in secret, whereas in this statement that God does not cry is referring to the outer chambers. So the resolution to the dilemma is God has basically two chambers, but again, read this more like poetry than prose. I would use the word dimensions or manifestations or realms, right? And that you have a God who is both able to weep, bivate gavae, and habivate varae. So you've got an inward facing God who weeps and the outward facing God who smiles. Reading on a bit. Wait a minute. The Gemara is never satisfied with just one. That seems to be like a perfect resolution. There's not a difficulty here. We've got a God who both weeps and a God who smiles. And the harmonization between the two is one happens here, one happens there. But wait. Uvavate v'ra'ela. But wait a minute. Doesn't God cry outwardly? I mean, all of this is fascinating. If you just take a pause and go, wait a minute, are we really talking about this is what we would call an anthropopathic God. You're probably familiar with the word anthropomorphic, and you might even be inclined to say, oh, this is just an anthropomorphic God. But if you really want to be specific with your language, anthropomorphic means looks like a human, morph, shape, right? Morph means shape. So anthro, which means human or man. Anthropomorphic means shaped like a human, looks like a human. A God has legs, God has a nose, God has ears to hear, God has hands, an outstretched hand and a mighty arm. Like all of that imagery is anthropomorphic. But a God who feels like a person feels, a God who weeps and laughs and dances, and not dances because that's anthropomorphic, but a God who rejoices and a God who weeps, that's anthropopathic. A God who takes on the color and the character of human feeling. All right. Again, back to the dilemma, though. Wait a minute. Can't God cry outwardly? Isn't it written? And here's another good biblical text. And on that day, the Lord, the God of hosts, called to weeping and to mourning and to baldness, the shaving of the head as a sign of mourning, and to girding with sackcloth, a very overt mourning. As Isaiah says, if you want to look up the text, it's here on the sidebar. They use the lovely phrase tonsuring, shaving of your head, right? Which is, again, one of the many, many parts of the prophetic literature that is about forecasting doom. Okay. So wait a minute. What about this Isaiah God who appears to have all of these very overt outward weeping, doesn't need a private crying room, right? And the Gemara responds, it's different with the destruction of the temple. For even the angels of peace cried, as it is stated, behold, their valiant ones cry without, and the angels of peace weep bitterly. Again, from the prophet Isaiah. We're going to do one more section and then we'll talk. Okay, and it goes back to Isaiah, back to Jeremiah now. My eye shall weep sore and run down with tears because the Lord's flock is carried away captive. Rabbi Elazar said, why are these three references to tears in the verse? Why do we need to talk about tears three times? Damoa, that's one. Ugh, sorry, it does that every time I try and highlight. This word here, tidma, v'tered eni dim'a. All right, so you have three times where the Hebrew root word for tears, here, here, and here. Tears, tears, tears. Why do we have three references to tears in this verse? And this is a very customary way of doing a drush. One is for the first temple, one is for the second temple, and there is no third temple, at least not yet. And one is for the Jewish people who were exiled from their place. Or a different interpretation, there are those who say the last one is for the unavoidable dereliction of the study of Torah in the wake of the exile. In other words, the consequences of exile are not merely displacement from home, not merely displacement from temple, which was the locus of centralized worship for the ancient Israelite community, and of course the spiritual focal point for all of ancient Judaism, but also that in exile, when we are uprooted from the source, Torah is also diminished or left by the wayside. So it's an interesting argument considering that it's an exilic community of rabbis writing it. So I want to just like allow us to process all of this and perhaps think about what this text says about the thing we're really talking about today, which is public Jewish mourning observances. We're not just talking about the funeral practice when a loved one dies. What are we saying about how Jewish people observe painful periods like the entire Omer minus 1 day, Lag BaOmer, which was the first text we looked at today, consonant with the fact that we're in the Omer right now, and just coincidentally linked to the fact that this week we're reading about the counting of the Omer in the Torah portion and more. And also having just had a Yom Ha-Zikaron. Now, obviously, it would be anachronistic for me to suggest that the Gemara is commenting directly on Yom Ha-Zikaron. It is not. Yom Ha-Zikaron has only existed after the establishment of the State of Israel. Nevertheless, Yom Ha-Zikaron taps into something that is really, I think, an important comment on the Jewish people and Judaism, which is that sometimes we need overt public displays of sadness. And by the way, I don't think there's really anything in American life like this that has been institutionalized the way it has been in Jewish life, save for 9/11. Right? We don't have, for instance, a Pearl Harbor Day. And in terms of death toll and the degree to which it was a consequential day in history, as Roosevelt said, a day that shall live in infamy, December 7th, 1941, it is interesting to me that we don't really have a Pearl Harbor Day, given the fact that relative to like 9/11, death toll is actually really similar. 9/11 is greater in numbers, but in terms of impact, I think you could argue that Pearl Harbor was just as earth-shattering and consequential for America as 9/11 was. And 9/11, again, we haven't really, it's not a federal holiday. It's not a day off of work. It's a very painful day in American life and has been for the last 22 and a half years. But again, it's not officially so yet. We don't have like a Civil War Day to commemorate the incredible death toll of tens of thousands of Americans. And again, even our Memorial Day is sales and barbecues. So I'm pointing out this cultural difference to suggest that American civilization, at least white Protestant American civilization, seems not to have encoded into its official public behaviors what Judaism makes space for. And the Talmud grapples with this idea of public weeping and the rationale for it. A rationale is perhaps too soft a word. The spiritual underpinning for this is that we believe, as it were, or we accept the idea of a God who weeps, which is not something we talk about very often. But this idea of a God who weeps for the suffering of the chosen people, I think, is a very theologically potent idea. And I'd like us to spend the last 15 minutes just talking about it. So I see a few hands. We'll start with Mara.
Is Juneteenth getting us somewhere that way?
Juneteenth is a happy day. And the way it's observed, at least, and Juneteenth has been observed for some time in the African American community, but Juneteenth marks the day when the last enslaved Africans in America learned that they had been emancipated. So in a sense, Juneteenth is a liberation festival and is observed joyfully, particularly in the Black church. So no, I guess
Okay.
no, right? It really isn't. We don't have a day for the assassination of our leaders. We don't have a day. I mean, again, Memorial Day. Memorial Day is the one thing, but we don't observe it in a publicly solemn or sorrowful way, the way Judaism gives us space. It's not the dominant thing we do as Jews, most of our observances are happy. But there are a few that are intentionally not happy. Like they become the word that's used in the Gemara here is mistarim, like God needs space to go and weep. And then I find it very interesting that the dialogue here, the debate here is, does God need to do it in private? And if God doesn't need to do it in private, because the conclusion of the passage, or at least where we end it, is no, God weeps overtly, doesn't need a mistarim, doesn't need a secret crying.
I don't know how to do chat.
What, Judy, are you trying to, Judy Last, do you want to chime in?
Oh, yes, thank you very much.
No problem.
I think that there is a big cultural difference. For example, public weeping unites a group of people. They become one, even if they have differences. When you look at the founding of the United States, the whole concept, Teddy Roosevelt, there is the whole idea of rugged individualism. There is also a different sense, again, I believe culturally, about your connection with God. Because Judaism has you in a different connection where man was made in God's image and God is good and you try to help the world. You don't have any of these guilt feelings that you have to, save the world because Christ was killed by all the people. And I think the lack of the united group of people is one of the big problems that is coming home to roost today. Because
I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. I do think you're right that there's a recognition at the kind of like a psychic level that public mourning is a source of strength and unity for a people, and not what I believe it is associated with in America, which is that weeping and crying is weakness. And I really worry about that. I've been thinking a lot about it, like the inability for Americans to weep together as a community, contra Israelis, by the way, in contradistinction to how Israelis observe the very painful parts of their country's history and very much their country's present, their national history, their national identity, and indeed their sense of national destiny, makes room for public weeping, makes room for mourning, makes room for the acknowledgement of the ways in which we are wounded, and is not considered to be a sign of weakness. And I worry that in America, it actually is part and parcel of a kind of distinctive lack of empathy. God forbid we should have a day where we acknowledge, like, Mara, your comment about Juneteenth is actually really well taken. And of course, I'm ad-libbing here, but what if we had a day to acknowledge, the hurt we've inflicted on enslaved Africans and America's indigenous peoples? Like that, I think Indigenous Peoples Day becoming the kind of twin or the binary identity for Columbus Day is perhaps a meaningful step in that direction, but it's still going to be like, and today we celebrate Native American Heritage Day. That's what Indigenous Peoples Day is. It's not a day for, let's have a national reckoning with the suffering of at least some American communities. We just don't do that here.
There is another difference I was listening to, and I was thinking between the wake and the Shiva. Shiva is where people get together and try as a community, after the pain has really kind of, I guess, settled, to work together as a group to try to make the group take care of one another. Whereas, and I'm not criticizing, whereas the wake, you go in and it's kind of, okay, so we're going in, we're going to say hi, we're sorry, I'm going to walk out and leave.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen all different kinds, so I think you can fall into a stereotype trap here. But yeah,
Right.
I accept your general premise that the feel, the mood, the tone, and perhaps the underlying intention behind Shiva as a place where it is okay to cry openly, as opposed to a wake where I've been to a number of wakes where I don't remember any public crying at wakes. And again, I haven't been to that many wakes. I've been to a few thousand Shivas. Okay, let's hear some other voices. Thank you, Judy. Let's do another
Thank
Judy.
you.
Veterans Day is our day to honor our soldiers. So that would be a comparable, except that our country has not been through what Israel's been through. But it is this day of remembering the veterans, people who have fought and died.
Correct. It is. And again, I think that on paper, it sounds a lot like Yom Ha-Zikaron, but in practice, the two holidays are so different.
Exactly. They're honoring soldiers, but Israel is honoring its existence.
Yeah.
And remembering its existence.
Yeah, it could be also that
But
we
it is
don't
Veterans
feel,
Day.
could be that we just don't feel that our existence as a nation is precarious, the way Israelis are deeply in touch with that precariousness. By the way, I'm saying this mostly to their credit, but I also think constantly feeling that you're living on a knife's edge of vulnerability creates or may facilitate a kind of bunker mentality where it becomes harder to be empathic toward the other because you always feel that you're threatened and you've got to take care of yourself first. Thank you, Judy. Mom and Dad.
I just wanted to elaborate on Judy Latz's comment about the cultural importance here, because it makes a lot more sense in Israel to talk about a unification between Judaism and the cultural norms of an entire country, because it was founded as a Jewish state. Does not pertain to the melting pot of America, because if you talk about, anything, American burial customs, we're talking about Native Americans, we're talking about Hispanics, we're talking about, Irish.
Yeah.
It just does not pertain in the same unified way that you can make the kind of one-on-one matchup between being a Jew and being an Israeli and how you celebrate things in the public domain.
Very well taken. And again, I think the differences are really stark. If you spend any time traveling among African Americans in America, you'll realize you've got multiple civilizations who are American. And melting pot is probably wrong. Although a melting pot is more aspirational than descriptive. A better descriptor is tossed salad, right? Steve and then Russell, please.
So what this makes me think about is the separation of church and state, and somehow in America, patriotism is about power, and the leave to religion, sorrow. And
there is no separation of religion and state in Israel.
Not effectively.
Not effectively.
And the entire I guess the Hasidic tradition, Kabbalistic tradition of speaking of repairing the world, it just talks about how the world is broken itself.
Right. You can't have a Tikkun Olam tradition without the ability to begin from the premise of the world's brokenness, which means you have to be both attentive to and empathic toward the brokenness in the world.
But that's not the approach in the United States secularly.
I completely agree. And I believe that Americans also have more of a defensiveness around critique. I mean, just even the idea that there are certain things, even today in 2024, that in many, 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 many states in the United States, you just can't teach about our history without igniting or adding fuel to a kind of mindless culture war disturbs me. Though that's probably more true about most countries and cultures than it is not true, even Israel. As much as I'd love to believe that Israel is this place where open discourse about its own, brokenness in the places where it is broken, I'm not suggesting that brokenness is the overarching descriptor that best fits Israel today. In certain ways, that might be true, but that's not my point. My point is that it is probably hard for most cultures to look in that deep, dark, truthful mirror and say, I weep for all the ways in which our people, our society, are broken. Nice insight, Steve. I appreciate you sharing them. Russell, please.
Well, Steve raised the very important topic. And I'd like to expand on that because I find the idea of God weeping to be a little depressing because it suggests that there's nothing else to be done. And I mean, as for patriotic weeping, national events, I think weeping is great for about 10 minutes, but what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do to alleviate the things that brought you to that point of despair where you're now just kind of helpless and all you can do is weep? And if the idea of God weeping means, and God is not going to lift a finger to do anything to guide us to an amelioration of the situation, I think it actually degrades the concept of God.
Well said. And by the way, the Gemara, should anyone choose to continue with Chagigah 5b, it goes on to say, and by the way, there are actually a number of things that make God cry every single day. So we had the destruction of the first temple, we had the destruction of the second temple, we had the exile of the Jewish people, we had the dereliction of Torah. And it goes on to say, well, there are other things that really upset God as well. And again, these appear to be like classic Jewish guilt trip. So one is a person who has the ability to study Torah and does not. So, in other words, everyone except the people on this Zoom. No, I mean, we have a lot of people who choose to study Torah at WRT. I'm so blessed to show up on a Thursday morning and just have a community of people who want to do this together. How incredibly nice for all of us. But, the majority of our congregants are not here today because they have other things to do. God also weeps for one who is unable to engage in Torah study, but tries to do it, which really disturbs me. But maybe that's because that person is neglecting other even more important responsibilities. And this is fascinating. The third thing is for a leader who acts like a dictator over his community. It says, and it's in the very next 2 paragraphs that follow where we stop today, that God also weeps for a person who lords over the community. So again, yeah, I'm with you, Russell. The idea of a God who's just kind of like decomposed off in a secret crying room, unable to pull the God's self, as it were, together, it gets old very fast. To the extent that all of these texts are to be taken poetically or allegorically and say, okay, what does this say about God? But also, what does this say about us? And this idea of the text could be a question of what is hurtful or harmful in a society, and trying to have a people hold together in exile, removed from, or still mourning a temple that was now twice destroyed, able to connect with one's faith only through a Torah, and subject to the predations of dictators, pretty well describes the condition of the Jewish people. And for that, there is a lot to weep over. I'm not sure that it is paralyzing for the Jewish people historically, but perhaps it is. I know some people who are, and I get it, but if Netanyahu continues to say that the pain of October 7th is a permanent obstruction to talking about the day after the war, I will agree that the time for weeping has come and gone, and it's time to move on. One more comment from Barbara, then I have a housekeeping comment, and then we'll go enjoy the rest of our days, and no more crying. Okay, Barbara.
Okay. I'm stuck on the word mastir,
Which means to hide. Or
to hide, but it also means to kind of turn away.
Mm-hmm. To turn away, or to cover up, or
right.
Yep.
And I find that very curious that they would
well, I mean, this is not uncommon in the rabbinic literature to describe God as a fellow exile. And again, one of the interesting things that happens when Judaism is uprooted from its land and its temple is that it becomes a portable tradition, but it also becomes an uprooted tradition. And therefore, God has to come with us into exile. And so this idea of a God who is experiencing exile and the ravages of it along with the Jewish people, I don't know. I find it poetically potent.
Or else God is turning aside and not looking.
Perhaps. And of course, that idea would flourish in the wake of the Holocaust.
Right.
The idea of a God who actually had totally abandoned us.
Right.
The idea that Jewish theology has room for all of these different expressions of God is also should be fascinating to all of us.
Yeah.
The multivocality of our way of talking about God and depicting God, to me, is one of the best things about Judaism. But again, not for people who want simple declarative statements and dogmas.
Right.
Okay. So a little housekeeping. We're concluding today's class. We meet again next week, which is the 23rd. Then we go on a spring hiatus. And we were actually supposed to end before Memorial Day, but because Shavuot is so late this year, Shavuot is actually the 11th and 12th of the night of the 11th and the morning of the 12th. You'll get some more announcements about how we're observing Shavuot. And then I am going to hold 2 more sessions before I go on summer break, but we've got to wait about a month. So we'll meet next week, and then we will reconvene on the 20th and 27th of June. I'll make sure that that's reflected in the bulletin. I appreciate your flexibility. We'll do Shavuot next week, and then I'm holding open the topics for the 20th and 27th. I promise to find something good for us to talk about. Maybe something leading up to Tisha B'Av, maybe something totally unrelated, but I will open a Zoom for us to learn Gemara together on June 20th and 27th. Unfortunately, between the 30th and the 13th of June, I have commitments on those Thursday mornings that can't be moved. And I, again, had not originally scheduled for the class to go past Memorial Day, but I'd like to just do 2 more sessions, and always appreciate you being here. If you can't make it to class, we record all of them, so please join us. Further housekeeping: tomorrow night, we will acknowledge Yom Ha-Zikaron and Yom Ha-Ha'atzmaut, both the pain and the joy, but also we're using tomorrow night as a chance to say thank you and good luck and farewell to 2 members of the clergy team, our assistant rabbi, Rabbi Sasha Bacon, and our associate cantor, Danielle Radnitsky, have been wonderful and very loving and loved servants of the Jewish people here at WRT. And I hope you can come to express your gratitude, or if not, tune in online, maybe put a nice wish in the chat window of Facebook if you tune in via social media or YouTube. And I look forward to wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom tomorrow. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you very much, John. I hope everybody has a healthy week.
Bye.
Shabbat Shalom.